So the next step is interpreting asset map reports. So this is now after you've engaged with the client, you've built their map, you've applied the stencils. What are the frameworks that you can use to engage with the client, to open up conversation and elevate that engagement? And once again, I'm going to do the poll thing. I will remember to share the results now. So let's start off. If you could all just work through that. What aspects of your existing client engagement are you most excited to progress?
And Kirsty, we need to animate it for people because they can't see the screen. So what we're seeing as the
I know,
panelists, we can see
share.
all the different questions, how people are responding. So we can see the initial response already is under understanding better what makes your client tick, and identifying new opportunities is now in the lead. So the second one from the bottom.
Articulating your value proposition, running up from the rear.
Goal identification is lagging behind a little bit, but oh, this is huge fun. I mean, I'm sorry that the rest of the guys can't see it, but yeah. So now at the moment,
we can share when it's
the second one and the second last one. I mean, they're neck and neck.
They're neck and neck, but identifying new opportunities for providing advice seems to be taking the lead. Yeah, still moving. Okay, we still got votes coming in. But again, I mean, I'll share. I'll stop that now and share. Thank you to everyone who's filled that in. Just end that, and then I can share the results, and everybody can see. But what is interesting is it's quite a spread for this one. You know, between. Okay, we can see the leading ones is identifying new opportunities, which is great because that's what we want to do, is uncover those opportunities and provide advice. But understanding your client better, I really like that one because that's going to come up now in some of the frameworks. But also articulating your value, goal identification. So quite nicely spread between those. None on implementing agreed actions. That's good.
And you know, a funny thing, Kirsty, and I keep on being completely amazed by it, is that we deal with so many advisors, and in some respects, Asset Map is quite simple tech, and every practice uses Asset Map different. It is just amazing that the emphasis or the focus or how they use it or where they use it, it's different, and I find that fascinating. Yeah.
And it's endless. You know, you learn new ways of people using it all the time, which is great.
So have you shared now?
I did.
Did you share the results?
Yeah,
okay, cool.
I did share the results. Yeah. So everybody saw. Perfect. All right. So the frameworks that we're going to explore today is to do exactly that. Some is for goal identification. Some is to understand the client better. Some is to uncover opportunities and engagements. And the three, and some of you may have seen these before, so please we'll go through them again as a reminder. But if you've used any of them, please share in the chat how you're using them and what works well for you. The first one is what we call the 5 whys. Second one is the 4 frames of view. And the third one, which has got quite a bit of attention lately with signals, is the 6 L's or financial fire drills. And we're just going to work through each one of these in a little bit of detail and how you could bring that into your engagement process. So the first one, 5 Whys, was inspired by a TV show from quite some time ago with Detective Columbo. So I haven't personally seen it. Maybe some of you have seen it. But for those that haven't, I'm going to give a little bit of background from my understanding of what the show is about. But he was a detective, often thought to be sort of, you know, a bit of a disheveled appearance, not very intimidating. And he would interrogate these, you know, potential or these people who had committed crimes. And because of his appearance and the way he and his personality, they would often think they've got away with it. And right before he would leave the interrogation room, he would turn around and say, oh, just one last thing or one more question. And that would usually be the question where the person was caught so off guard that they incriminate themselves. And you know, that's what the show is about. Now, I'm not suggesting a framework that we're going to do that with clients or try and catch them off guard, but the intention is to ask questions, to ask open-ended questions, to understand how the client makes decisions, what their intentions are, how they've built what they've built to today. And really how it works is taking an asset map and putting it in front of the client. And the idea is to ask 5 why questions about what you see on the map. Now, as someone who's engaged in coaching, we're always told the why question you should never use. You should only use other questions, because why creates a feeling of having to be defensive. So the client might sit there and go, why is he asking me that? Or why is she asking me that? And feel, the need to be defensive. So a better question for me is to say, tell me more. Now, I take the point that it's far less catchy than the 5 whys, so you can remember it like, but rather say, tell me more about this. And examples could be, if you're sitting in front of the client with their asset map, even the block that shows their salary and their employer, just asking them, tell me more about this. How long have you worked there? What do you see as your, career path there in the future? Just asking that question, tell me more about that. You'll start to get insight into where the client is in their life, what their hopes are for the future, and what they want to achieve with that. And you would repeat this. The idea is to repeat it at least 5 times, but to just work through the map with the client. If there's an investment, a unit trust, tell me more about this. The client might say, well, I've earmarked that for education or for adventure, or it's emergency funding. Or, one client the other day said, no, that's my fund for medical. I want to self-fund for medical, and that I keep that, for any medical needs that I have. Immediately by asking that question, you've gained insights into clients' thought patterns and behavior. So for that client, they prefer to self-insure for medical, and understanding that is important as we go forward in advising that client. So using this method of tell me more about it opens up a conversation around how the client makes decisions, what how they've made decisions over time, so what's led them to the picture that they have today, but it also gives you insight into sort of principle based and what they want to achieve. So this first framework is really put the map in front of the client and explore all the blocks on the page and ask more information about that, especially if you use discovery. So if you send out the discovery link and the client comes back and they've completed it, and you put that map in front of them for the first time, this is a great framework to use with that client to really understand. Tell me about the people at the top. Tell me about, see, you've added your mother. Tell me more about that. That is what's going to gain insights into what's important to them and how they want to move forward. So that's our first framework. And just to reiterate, the point is to understand intention, the intent behind the decisions they made, what was intentional, what wasn't, and also to get a sense of the patterns and how the client makes choices and how that's going to feed into the advice we give in the future. Okay. The next framework is the 4 frames, and I really love this framework, especially if you think about bringing other people in the practice to view the asset map, because what this looks at is we all have different lenses when we're looking at the map based on our own experience, our own knowledge, and we see different things. And we always say it's quite funny, but if you put a map in front of 2 people, they will come up with different things. They will see different insights, different things will come up for them. And 4 frames is about thinking about the map from these different perspectives. So putting different lenses on and viewing the map through that lens to see if anything different comes up for you and things that you can take forward with the client. So to work through it, the first lens is to look at it from an insurance point of view. So if you had an insurance expert looking at the map, what are some of the things that they're going to be focusing on? Well, they're probably looking at the ratios between, income the client's earning and life cover, or income and, income disability or income protection. They're looking for gaps in insurance. Is there medical aid? Is there potentially gap cover? What about short-term cover? So they're specifically going to focus on what they see in that insurance space. But if I have someone with a legal background looking at the map, I'm going to look at it for different things. I'm going to look at things like structure, what's sitting in the business versus the trust, what's sitting in the primary client's name, what's sitting in the spouse's name. Is that optimal? I'm going to be looking at, who are the beneficiaries, who are the trustees, looking at it more from a legal nature. If we then go to investments, and I think of it from an investment point of view, if I'm a specialist in that, I'm going to be looking at things like what strategy are they targeting? Are the funds appropriately invested? Looking at maybe allocation across those. I'm going to be looking at what they're contributing. Is there gaps in discretionary versus retirement funds? Those are the types of things I'm going to be focusing on. And of course, if I'm looking at it from a tax point of view, I'm again looking at things like estate planning, looking at marital regimes. I'm looking at, are they using, their full contributions and allowances to the best of their ability? So just going to that very high level, obviously you can go into that in more detail, you can already see that by looking at the map through these different lenses, I'm going to focus in on and uncover different opportunities, different risks for each, for that client by looking at it from these different lenses. And this works well as a framework to just work through a map with the client to see what are the gaps. Have I gone through all of them? Because perhaps I start with an insurance gap and I focus there and I miss a legal point or an investment point or a tax point. And it also works well in bringing other people in the practice into that conversation. So if you've viewed a map, if you bring someone else in the team in to look at it and see what comes up for you, what are the gaps or, possibilities that you see when you look at this map. And the second component of that 4 frames, where it works really well, is in review. Often we find planners will say, I've done the client's plan, they're set up, it's moving along, really nicely, but it's time for review. What do I engage with them on? And working through this framework with the clients is very powerful as well. Adam often says, I put the map in front of the clients and I show them, I look at this from a legal perspective. These are the things we've put in place to make sure you're appropriately, structured from that perspective. If we look at this from an insurance perspective, these are the gaps that we filled over time. And then from investment and tax as well, because it's a framework that you can use for yourself to uncover potential gaps and opportunities, but it's also a framework that you can use in engaging with clients to show them what is the process that we go through when we're reviewing, their plan and ensuring that their plan is appropriate for the future. This is one of the frameworks we use and some of the things that we're doing in between. Gary, any points on those two? And I'll go into 6 Rs. All good.
I love the 5 whys. Just the thought around being really curious about, even with the analogy of walking into somebody's house and asking them about the stuff that you see, and like even in a virtual engagement, like my bicycle on the wall, just like I often have conversations with people that are curious, and they ask about the bike on the wall, and it's not the conversation doesn't lead down the road that you actually expect, but I think that there's something in assumption, so seeing the bike on the wall and seeing an asset map and assuming a whole bunch of stuff about somebody. I think that the curiosity to ask about, and I just love 5 things, just choose 5 things to be curious about. And I think the answers that you get will be a surprise. So, and the same thing with the bike on the wall. I think the answers that I'm giving now are different to the answers that I was giving a year ago. So, I think it's such a relevant framework to just keep in the back of your mind, and just to keep that curiosity up and keep the assumptions at bay.
Yeah, I like that, Gary. You often say you want to ask with curiosity and empathy, it's those key points. You want to ask from a place of curiousness. I want to understand you more. I want to understand you better. And clients will pick up on that. If you're asking from that place, they'll feel comfortable to share more. So 100%. That's I like.
So I think it's time for me to change the bicycle.
And if I can maybe add one other aspect, Kirsty, and often when we do things like, those 4 frames, reviewing from an investment perspective, sometimes I get advisors telling me, Benny, don't tell me how to do it, like give advice. I know exactly. And that's not the point here. And I think that's a really subtle but important thing, is we often advisors would do those 4 frames intuitively or by habit and not tell their clients. So the critical thing here is not that's how you need to give advice, or that's how you need to think about advice. That's how you need to engage clients about the advice and the value that you add to them. So very subtle difference, not how you do advice, it's how you should be engaging your clients on the advice that you deliver to them.
Yeah, and sharing that. Well, thanks, guys. That's great. Good points. Okay. And then the last one is the 6 L's, the financial fire drills. And the thinking behind this, and we shared this a little bit with the Signals launch as well, is this framework was inspired by, if there is a fire drill, we've all experienced those before, and what the reason we've experienced it is because there's a very clear plan. This is who you speak to. This is where you go. This is what we've got in place, if there were to ever be a fire. And the idea behind this framework is to say there are really 6 areas or events that could potentially derail a client or family's financial plan. And we just want to be aware that we've gone through each of these events, that we've unpacked that with the client. So again, not only if we know there's a plan in place, so that the client knows what that plan is and who to call and what those steps are should one of these happen. And they're very interesting, the 6 different ones, because the level of depth you can go to in each of them can carry on and on and on and on in terms of conversing with clients on how far you go. But just to briefly touch on each of them, the first one is liquidity. Understanding if something happens and you lose your income, what is your plan? Is there emergency funding that you have available for that? Is there access to cheap debt that you can access if you need to? Let's unpack what is the plan in that situation and how we would move forward. The next one, if there's a disability in the household, someone becomes disabled, you can say the same for if someone loses a life or there's a severe illness. What is our plan? Is the client protected against one of those events happening so that it doesn't derail their financial plan? And do they know what those steps are, what that plan is, and what the steps are? The fifth one then, longevity, that really talks to the fact that clients are living longer than before, and how optimized are they for that? Is there enough funding to ensure that they can sustain their lifestyle as they live longer and into the future? And the sixth one is legacy. And this is a very broad, conversation. It could start off with, is everything in place? Is the will in place? What about, beneficiaries? Are they up to date? But it also expands into, the conversation that Benny had recently on a webinar about, mental capacity and administration. All of that fits into this bucket. Have we discussed all of these concepts? And do we know what the plan is? And do we have that in place to work through? And of course, stencils is a way of sort of bringing this framework to life, where we've built in algorithms to show if a client is red, amber, or green across the event. Sorry,
Signals.
Gary?
Signals, not stencils.
Did I say stencils?
Yes.
Sorry, signals. Brought in signals to really bring this to life. And they will show, whether you red, amber, or green across these 6 events. And they do that by looking at the numbers that we've got in Asset Map. But most important for this framework is to work through it with the clients. And a great way they do that in the US is they actually put the map in front of the client and say, if there's a liquidity event, what's our plan? And the client will say, we've got this funding for that, or this is the plan in that event. But working through it with the client, not because we haven't done that process, but so they can reflect back to us as well, that they understand what that process is going to be, and they're aware that there is a plan in place should any of these events happen. Just from a support point of view, you can also find this document in the reports tab for a client. You can generate it. It's just a great document to work through that framework with the clients. Let's just go through each of these. Is there a plan? Do we need to modify it at all? And include notes around, these are the steps that we're going to take in that process. And maybe just to touch on signals briefly, when you reflect that, often I always say if a planner looks at a map, immediately there's a problem with liquidity or there's an issue in the event of a disability. But signals is a great way of showing a mirror to the client. So just reflecting that. And one of our planners positioned it as, I show the client signals to say, look, this is what the system is saying. It's saying there's a potential problem there. But I want to delve into your unique circumstance. That's why you're meeting with me and not a system, is we want to go into your unique circumstances, unpack what your needs are in that situation and how you're planning on funding it, and see, is it actually red? Is it amber? Is it green? And how do we take steps to move along that path? So try it out, use signals, or use this document if you feel more comfortable working through those engagements with the client. Is there a plan in place, and how do we move forward? And then just before we go into a quick 5-minute break, this is a framework that's actually used by radiologists. They call it the ABCs framework, and it's about first systematically working through this process of, look for alignment and joint space. Then you move on to bone texture, cortices, soft tissue. But what I liked about this is what they're taught as part of that framework is when you're working through it, there's often people will pick up something in step 1 or in step 2 and then not move on to step 3 or step 4. So when you think about any of these frameworks, it's not to use to find something, it's to work through the entire framework and see what we uncover. And it might be that there's 5 things, and I'm not saying you need to then, work through all 5 at once. You can then prioritize which ones we're going to tackle first, but work through the entire framework to uncover all of that. So I like that principle and wanted to share that today. And then lastly, they say, every client is a client review meeting, or rather every client meeting is an engagement meeting, to say. And I think if we think about, all these frameworks that we've just worked through, the 5 whys, the 6 L's, the, 4 frames, the question can become, when do we use it, or how do we use them all in an engagement with the client? And I think the other concept of reviews is, typically when we think of reviews, we think of looking backwards. We're reviewing what has happened, and there's a tendency to sort of jump into, this is how the products have progressed over the year, or jump into the target map to show the client progression towards a goal. But it's important first in every engagement with the client to start with the report and the asset map. Where are you today? Let's start with, where is the client today, and get on the same page with that. And why that's important is it sort of shifts the conversation. As soon as you start reviewing, the something that's happened, then that becomes the focus, whether that's on performance or the fees, you're reviewing where the client is at or the product is at. But as soon as you put the map in front of the client as the first step in any review conversation, you're shifting the conversation to, where are you today? What is more important is, where is the client today? And then how do we take the steps forward to further progress along your goals? And just shifting that conversation from looking backwards to, we're here today and we want to take a step forward. So here's just a visual that you could use to see how those different frameworks would work. But I think the key point here, and you'll find the way that works best for you, but the key point is starting in that orange and green section, building rapport with the client. What's changed in your life? What's different? How have things progressed? And then working through, let's get on the same page. Where are we today? What's changed? What's new? What do we need to uncover? Again. Okay, and then you could work through the different frameworks and end with, product suitability and how you move forward. But important not to jump into the end side of this review in that engagement. You want to start with that building rapport and getting onto the same page with the client by working through the map. All right. Just before we'll take a 5-minute leg stretch now. But any questions, Gary, any thoughts that you want to add in?
I was busy Googling while you were chatting there. I mean, your medical framework reminded me of the framework that they do on newborn babies, called the Apgar test.
Yes.
So I know I've seen it 3 times. So as soon as the baby pops out, they do these 3 steps.
Yes.
Or 5 steps. Sorry, I think it's 5 steps. And that, just that simple introduction into into the routine of the doctors, reduced infant mortality by like a lot, and it's just amazing to see that I mean that they do it habitually. So with all three of my kids, different doctors, um, all of the doctors do this thing habitually. So I think it's such a powerful thing to have a framework to rely on, to come back to and say, okay, well, let me make certain that I'm covering all my bases, I'm doing all the appropriate things.
And
100%.
yeah, and maybe Gary, I mean, when I look at this slide, my intuitive response is it's impossible to do all of this in a client review meeting. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Is because were we trained that second last block, the orange block? That's 30 or 40 minutes of the meeting. And so I think this really tests. Where do we want to focus our time and attention in our client review meetings? And as Gary said, like once it becomes habit, what is that? The 5 steps the doctor checks. It's quick. It doesn't have to be long, but it's really powerful.
Yeah. I think especially if you do something often and you're doing it every day, and you're in that unconscious competence space, a framework just helps you check in, is there anything that I've skipped or missed, and work that in again. So I think it's refining our process as well by just using the frameworks to touch base on that.
Yeah, and maybe to add one provocative point here. And this is actually from a UK advisor, which I actually had words with, a well-known UK advisor. His point was, we do a lot of work up front for a client, and then the client goes into maintenance mode. And yeah, we disagree with that fundamentally. In other words, there is no maintenance mode. People's lives change and stuff. And I think this is the thing that prevents us from slipping into maintenance mode with our review clients.
Yeah.
100%. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, that's the bicycle on the wall, isn't it? If you go into maintenance mode, you just assume.
It stays on the wall.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a 5-minute leg stretch. We'll come back at 10 past 10 and work through how you can practically implement that, as well as some cool features.